Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to today's discussion about China and the Gulf, hosted by our dear friends and partner organization, the Middle East Institute and the US-UAE Business Council. This webinar is quite timely in that it comes just 1 week after China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi concluded a week-long trip to the Middle East that saw him visit 6 countries: Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Iran, Oman, Bahrain, and of course the United Arab Emirates. Over the next hour, our distinguished panel of think tank leaders and experts on China-Gulf relations will contextualize this visit and provide insights into the significance of growing Chinese Gulf ties for China, the Gulf, and the United States. I'm delighted today to be joined by Michelle Al-Gergawi, who is the co-founder and CEO of Axis, which is an on-demand source of global information and analysis. Mr. Brian Katulis, who's a senior fellow at the at the Center for American Progress. Ms. Deborah Lair, who is the vice chairman and executive director of the Paulson Institute, CEO of Basilina, and board member at the Middle East Institute. Mr. Afshin Malavi, who is senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and Dr. Yuting Wang, who is an associate professor at American University of Sharjah and non-resident research fellow at Purdue University. Today, we are pleased to have over 300 registered guests from the US-UAE business community, government, academia, and notably, registered attendees include representatives from the U.S. Department of Defense, the U.S. Department of State, the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the U.S. Department of Commerce, the USDA, the United Nations, the Embassy of Israel, the Abu Dhabi Executive Affairs Authority, and the UAE Embassy in Washington, D.C. Partners from states of Alabama, Florida, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, and Virginia, as well as the Dubai Chamber of Commerce, will also be on the webinar as guests today. Press includes Arabian Business, the Financial Times, and Law.com. We are always delighted to welcome students from the American University of Sharjah, Georgetown, George Washington, NYU Abu Dhabi, NYU in New York, Khalifa University, the University of Maryland, the University of Pittsburgh, and Florida State University. I will remind our guests that this webinar is being live streamed and it will be recorded and posted on YouTube. Throughout the webinar, please submit any questions through the Q&A or chat functions. I'm delighted to now introduce Dr. Paul Salem, president of the Middle East Institute. Paul is an expert on political change, transition, and conflict, as well as the regional and international relations of the Middle East. He is the author and editor of a number of books and reports, including Escaping the Conflict Trap Toward Ending Civil Wars in the Middle East. Prior to joining the Middle East Institute, Dr. Salem was the founding director of the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut, Lebanon, between 2006 and 2013. And from 1999 to 2006, he was director of the Ferris Foundation, and in 89 to 1999 founded and directed the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies, Lebanon's leading public policy think tank. Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Danny, and welcome to people here in the US, people in the UAE, maybe people joining from China in the evening. I'm here as a co-host with my good friend Danny Seabright. It's a pleasure to co-host this event between the Middle East Institute and the US-UAE Business Council. This wonderful panel is going to explore a very fascinating topic, one that I would say has deep roots in history, but great impact on the present and the future. This question of the relationship between the Middle East and China goes back a couple thousand years to the Silk Road and the place of the Middle East in the global economy, and how that's been changing over the decades and over the centuries. China itself obviously is in a period of massive global growth, where the Middle East is one of the important areas for it in terms of energy resources, but also in terms of trade and exports and possibly transport issues and the like. The GCC and the UAE itself is in a historic transformation in terms of its connection to the global economy, from sort of backwaters that then began to be major exporters of energy to becoming really global hubs of trade and commerce. So they are also in a new paradigm, made all the more sort of visible and interesting after the recent Abraham Accords, which have obvious geopolitical consequences, but also trade, investment, technology, networking considerations. We're here in Washington, where there is a new U.S. administration trying to figure out first how to face the massive domestic challenges, but also how to organize its foreign policy. Both the U.S. and China, I would say, are in this early days of the Biden administration trying to size each other up and figure out what path they're going to be going down. The first meeting in Alaska reminded me of the adage about when the elephants fight, possibly the grass gets trampled. It was a pretty tense moment, and that does raise the general question for GCC, but for the Middle East, to what degree will U.S.-Chinese competition be dangerous, be risky, carry a lot of cost, or to what degree could it be positive competition in terms of opportunities and sort of triaging opportunities in economics and even in geopolitics and security. Obviously, there is a lot of economic bases to these relationships, and maybe that's the foundation: energy, trade, technology, transport, and all the like. But there's obviously also a geopolitical component. We had the visit by the foreign minister to countries on sort of the Arab side of the Gulf, but there was also the announcement of the major Chinese-Iranian treaty, agreement, whatever you want to call it. How does that impact the geopolitics of the region? The U.S. has made great power competition a main priority for itself, both in the Pentagon and government-wide. What does that mean for the geopolitics of the Middle East? And finally, there's the issue of politics itself. China presents a certain way of governing, which a lot of Arab countries find attractive, whereas the West, despite January 6th and all of its own troubles, generally presents quite a different model. So there's really a lot to talk about. I'm really looking forward to listening in on this wonderful panel. This is something we are trying to track very much at the Middle East Institute. It's a moving target, but a very fascinating one. So Danny, thanks for the partnership. I look forward to a very fascinating panel.
Paul, thank you so much. And thank you again for the partnership with MEI. We really, really do appreciate the opportunity today. Let's jump right in. Afshin, we know that China's influence in the Gulf is growing. On March 27th, as I said earlier, just a couple of weeks ago, Crown Prince Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed met with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi in what seemed to be a friendly meeting. The two leaders affirmed bilateral cooperation across a number of areas, including countering religious extremism, safeguarding stability, countering the coronavirus pandemic, and expanding business in energy, finance, and tech. To kick off today's conversations, Afshin, could you briefly contextualize China's current relationship with the Gulf and the U.A.E. in particular? What are China's interests in the Gulf? How have these interests evolved over time? And what does China hope to achieve by making the Gulf and the U.A.E. in particular a node in its Belt and Road Initiative? Over to you, sir.
Great. Thank you very much, Danny. And thanks to the US-UAE Business Council and to Paul and the Middle East Institute for hosting this event. And it's great to be on a panel with such distinguished colleagues and fellow travelers. So, when we talk about China, Middle East ties, whenever there's a meeting with an official from China, an official from the Middle East, often the talk of the old Silk Road comes up. But I don't think we have to go that far back. If we just go back to the year 1993, I point to that as a significant year, because that's the year in China where its oil production of about 4 million barrels per day met its oil demand. And ever since 1993, that oil demand line has been rocketing up, and the oil production line has remained steady. And in that 10 million barrel a day or so delta is part of the what I call Middle East China 1.0, where we saw Middle East states, particularly the Gulf oil and gas producing states, begin to send a lot of oil and gas to China. After all, we were witnessing one of the great geoeconomic transformations in history in China during this period. And what were they getting in return? China was sending a lot of manufactured goods to the Middle East and North Africa region. Now, when it comes to Middle East China 2.0, I talk about how it's important that now we're in a different phase where it's no longer just this transactional relationship of oil and gas being sent to China and manufactured goods coming in. In addition to those flows, we're starting to see capital flows, investment flows, and what I call heads of state flows, senior official flows. Lots of senior officials from the Middle East and North Africa region are turning up in the Great Hall of the People. And we're seeing a much more dense ties. And I think the year 2006 is a good year to point to in that regard. King Abdullah bin Abdulaziz of Saudi Arabia had just ascended the throne a few months earlier. Now you're the king of Saudi Arabia. You could go just about anywhere you want as your first head of state visit. Many countries would be glad to receive you. And he chose to go to China as his first head of state visit. He saw the writing on the wall. Saudi Arabia saw the writing on the wall. China was their most important demand growth for oil. Now, if you were to take this Middle East China 2.0, we're still in that period. We're not yet in Middle East China 3.0, which is where China plays a much more prominent role in the security of the region. I don't think we're close to that yet, but I think that that's a conversation that we may be having 10 or 15 years from now. And lastly, let me just say, when it comes to the U.A.E. and China, I mean, there's an organic inevitability, the way I see it, to this relationship of the U.A.E. and China. The world's largest trading nation, China, as it rose in the 90s and into the 2000s, met with one of the world's largest trading hubs, one of the most important trading hubs in the U.A.E. U.A.E. is a country of about 10 million people, but it does more international trade than Brazil, a country of 200 million plus. Right. So so early on, the U.A.E. China relationship was very much a Dubai China relationship. That was the China U.A.E. 1.0. Now it's grown much more into a robust relationship that involves Abu Dhabi, that involves significant strategic partnerships on many levels, investment flows, heads of state flows. And the most recent example, which I'm sure we'll get into, is this vaccine partnership between the U.A.E. And China. So I'll just leave it there for now.
Thanks, Afshin, and thanks for setting the stage for some of the historical aspect, if you will. Michelle Al-Gergawi, in industries ranging from oil to tech, China has established a very substantial footprint in the Gulf. Moreover, it's a vital trading partner and export destination for the Gulf countries, growing investment destination. Beyond this massive level of economic exchange, China has partnered with major Gulf entities on a deeper level, including in the defense and healthcare sectors. From a strategic perspective, what are the interests of the Gulf countries and the U.A.E. in particular with regard to their relationships with China beyond just being a consumer, a buyer of, if you will, of the oil and energy product? Over to you. You're on mute. You're on mute, Michelle.
I'm that guy. I was the guy on mute today. Thanks, Danny. I'm going to start with an analogy, as I often do, which is, think of the UAE as an Amazon Prime power user. Uses same-day shipping, uses the video tools, uses the books, and it's very happy using Amazon. For a variety of reasons, you experience the service differently than you once remembered. Maybe you discontinue stuff, they discontinue stuff you always got from there. Maybe they're excited about other markets. Maybe Walmart catches up, probably all. I think it's helpful to think of the UAE in that way, compared to kind of the post-Gulf War era, where the UAE was primarily and clearly keen to align with the US as the key strategic partner. I think the UAE today, if you could come up with a phrase, it would be strategic diversification. What that means is that it's going to be pursuing a very postmodern national strategy, where you basically pursue multiple strategic partnerships, plus many, many, many transaction deals. So I think from the perspective of the UAE, China is a fantastic country. It continues to innovate, is an exporter not just of cheap goods, but like incredible technology. It wants to move quickly. It's able to do a lot of things at a pace that the UAE wants. And that's how, we can see that. So, the way it pursues China is not so different from the way it's pursued Israel, from the way that it has excellent relationships with Egypt and Ethiopia at the same time. And I think we're finally able to see this because it really feels like the Arab Spring is over. And now that we kind of the fog of everything that like took, the Arab Spring, I think for the Middle East was a little bit like the Trump era for America. It was the one single issue that we talked about and couldn't look at anything else. And now that that's gone, we can finally look at things like that. And we can capture and see that someone like the UAE looks at China as a key strategic partner, but one among many. And by no means is there kind of a sunsetting of the relationship with the US and kind of the rise of China and view of it as a key strategic partner.
Okay, so thanks for that, Michelle. And Brian, when we get to you, I wanted to tease that bit out a little bit about transactional relationships to what is the development to strategic relationships. But first, Dr. Wang, in addition to these business ties between China and the UAE, we've witnessed a new level of people-to-people interaction as evidenced by a recent announcement of China's intentions to provide Chinese language lessons in 100 schools. In your book, Chinese in Dubai, you detail the experience of Chinese migrants settling in Dubai on a more permanent basis. What has this growing relationship between the UAE and China looked like on the ground? And could you expand upon the depth of these connections a bit, Dr. Wang?
Thank you very much, Danny, for this question. And then I think it is very clear that in the last several years, and the social cultural exchanges between China and the UAE has increased significantly. I just wanted to give a little bit of context about the Chinese language lessons. We know that Confucius Institute established a partnership with University of Dubai in 2011. And there's also Confucius Institute at Zayed University in Abu Dhabi that was established in 2010. So there has been this level of social cultural exchanges at the beginning of the 2010s. And then in the last couple of years, especially since 2018, China and the UAE stepped up its partnership to this, what we call the comprehensive strategic partnership. And so it is actually against that backdrop. And then we see this growing interest of Chinese business people and to come into the region. And this also actually allowed more diverse sort of explorations of other Chinese professionals. And in my research, I've actually saw this growing second generation Chinese and who were born and raised in the region, and they have actually developed a very real emotional attachment to the place. And then so last year, despite the pandemic, we saw the opening of the first Chinese school in Dubai, and this is called the Chinese School Dubai. This is the first Chinese national curricular school established overseas, supported with Chinese government funds. The teachers were recruited actually by Hangzhou Education Bureau. And so we can see that, this sort of development really shows that there's an interest among the Chinese expat community to develop deeper ties with the region, and they're sending their children there. And so this is one aspect. Another, and I would also like to mention that there's also a diversification of Chinese interest in the region. It's not just about trade anymore. I think most of us would sort of see China's interest as in economic activities, but then we also see young professionals developing in the region. For example, you have a lot of media startups right now who are actually really looking at this new market, and then they're trying to explore and then carve out their own field. And so I'm going to leave it here, and then probably, if we have opportunity to talk more about some of these interesting activities that are going on among the Chinese expat community. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And one just has to visit Dragon Mart in Dubai and a few places like that to really see the influence on the ground very tangibly. So with that, Brian Katulis, the concern over China in the U.S. Is a bipartisan issue. There's bipartisan agreement in a divided Washington today. that China is something that needs to be monitored and dealt with. The Biden administration has been outspoken about these concerns. And as Dr. Salem mentioned, in Anchorage last month, we witnessed the US take a more overtly competitive approach towards China. How would you characterize the Biden administration's strategies and goals as it relates to competition with China? And what has been the reaction of the United States to the growing ties between China and the Gulf? Have US Gulf relations been impacted by these growing ties? I know that's 3 or 4 questions there to unpack, but I'm going to leave it to your expertise to do so.
Great. It's really great to be with you all. And I'm eager for the time when we can all be together in person. And I think we're getting there soon. If I could characterize America's response to China's rise and its impact in places like the Middle East, today I would say it's pretty simple. We're trying to get our own act together. Some of this is a reaction to the pandemic and the economic challenges. But what we're seeing right now over the last few months, and I think it's been different under Trump, but we're trying to make America better positioned to compete in a constructive way with countries like China. And the main thing I would watch for, and I'll get to the plays that I would anticipate in places like the U.A.E. and the Middle East, but I would watch carefully what America is doing right now to transform its own economic model at home to compete with China and address big issues like climate change. These moves in 2021 will have spillover effects on US foreign policy and its global engagement. And I think it's underanalyzed by many people in the traditional foreign policy sectors. There will be new opportunities for countries like the U.A.E. and corporations to reshape their strategies and make new points of connection. And I like what Michelle said about the phrase strategic diversification, because if I have a similar phrase that I've described, I think, the last 10 years of what's going on in the international system. It's rational hedging. You have a number of countries understanding that the unipolar moment is over. There's multiple centers of power, and there's a geopolitical competition that is multifaceted. It's not just about conventional military hardware, but it's other arenas like technology, finance, capital flows. So the international system is changing. And here in the US, the only issue that really matters on foreign policy that pops with the American public is China. Iran doesn't matter. The Middle East does not matter. Even Israel, Palestine, all of these issues that get a lot of attention in the press, at the popular level, there's serious concern about the competition we face from China. So the main sort of, I think, reaction, and Biden quite clearly, his first 2.5 months, the center of gravity has been here at home and trying to transform and address problems here, but with a key focus of how do we actually compete in a constructive way with China. If I would look to one person in this emerging administration that I think is under-recognized and actually will play an important role, it's Catherine Tai, who's the US trade representative. And Danny, I encourage your organization actually to invite her to come, and she would be a great speaker on this topic and many more. I think she'll be important for 2 reasons. One, if you look at Biden's emerging foreign policy, I want to highlight the word emerging, because I think they're focused largely on domestic issues. There is an intense focus on connecting domestic renewal with a new style of international engagement. And it's not just trade, but it's a range of issues related to what I would call industrial policy. And I think she speaks to all of these issues, Catherine Tai does. The second reason I think she's important is she, unlike many other Biden nominees and appointees, got 98-0 unanimous support from the Senate, which demonstrates the point you made at the outset, Danny, that it demonstrates there's concern about China. Her profile is largely in the China realm, but she has a very internationalist approach. And we had a forum with her last year. I encourage people to look at it on our website at americanprogress.org, where she answered the question of what is America going to do internationally? With this focus again on what we can do to get our own act together, to strengthen our own companies, our own workers to be able to compete. She characterized a lot of what Trump did on China policy as defensive in nature, in a sense, trying to counter unfair trade practices and enforce trade rights. So what I think we're seeing is an attempt here, and I want to highlight it's an attempt to get our own act together, and this will have implications for countries like the U.A.E. I actually think US engagement on issues related to China and the Middle East, there will likely be a lot of continuity between the Trump administration and the Biden administration in a key regard. Just a year ago, if you remember, Secretary of State Pompeo flying to Israel and to Gulf states and essentially reading the Riot Act to a number of our closest security partners about their technological relationships, economic relationships with China. And I think that's going to be a key feature of the relationships in the region. The thing I would look for, and again, I'd go back to where I started, is look at what America's trying to do with the massive public investments in infrastructure and other things, and what that means actually for the potential that has for countries like the UAE. And I close also that I don't see necessarily the meeting in Anchorage as being negative. I think it's almost a return to true form in terms of two different entities laying out in a very traditional diplomatic format their differences of views. And if I were to predict, I think the Biden administration on China will ultimately be pragmatic. Yes, it will keep an eye on domestic politics and how China is viewed, but it will ultimately try to get to alignment on key issues where we need to work with China, like climate change, like avoiding more wars in the Middle East. Those are two big picture issues where I think the two countries agree, but there will be intense competition and in some ways adversarial on technology issues, on cybersecurity, on some conventional military issues. This will naturally have impact on countries like the UAE. But again, if we all agree that we're in this new geopolitical era of hedging or diversification, I think if you think strategically about it, it presents many more opportunities than threats for actually stabilizing places like the broader Middle East.
Brian, thank you. That was excellent, sort of as an overview of how we might think about navigating all of this. Deborah, our executive board is comprised of many of America's top companies, and we have senior executives this morning from our executive board represented by Parsons, ExxonMobil, Boeing, Honeywell. They're all very keenly interested in how the issue of China plays out in the US and then how it affects their business, obviously, around the world. Might the Biden administration approach manifest any changes, in your view, in China-Gulf relations, or perhaps make it harder for countries like the U.A.E., Saudi Arabia, others to engage with both the U.S. and China at the same time? We really appreciate hearing your views.
Great. Well, thank you so much for including me on this. And the discussion really has been very interesting so far. And just to build on some of the points that have been made previously, certainly I agree that with the Biden administration's approach when it comes to China, we really haven't seen a significant change from what was happening with the Trump administration, except in tone. And we see clearly that the administration wants to try and build up domestically, as Brian was saying. They want to coordinate with our allies where they can. But China isn't sitting around waiting for us to kind of get our act together. China is moving very rapidly forward. And let's take the issue of trade, since we did talk about Catherine Tai. This is not a priority issue for the administration. In Alaska, and I would agree that that was not viewed as a negative necessarily. There was the public dimension that we saw clearly. Sorry for my dogs here. And then there's the domestic angle, the behind closed doors discussions, which were much more productive. And that really was laying out a number of issues, but they didn't discuss trade. And it's very interesting, since that is one of the most important issues that we have with China, and really is going to be at the heart of what our disagreements are. And as we see what the relations are growing between the Middle East and particularly the Gulf countries and China, it's trade that is at the core of that relationship. It hasn't really moved into the foreign policy realm. And I agree with the first speaker, 15 years from now, we may talk about that, because China's interests will be so deep in the Middle East that they will have to start to address some of the foreign policy issues. But now that the basic core of the relationship is trade. And it was very interesting that one of the first acts by the administration on trade, even before Catherine Tai was in office, was actually to resort to a Trump administration strategy. They reimposed tariffs on aluminum with the U.A.E. And I thought that was a very strong political symbol of what they view as their ability and the tools that the administration will have, because it clearly wasn't really a trade issue. It was a political statement that they were making. And as we see where the divisions are going to be in US-China relations, technology is at the core of that. And technology is where we're going to see significant differences. Even as we're in discussions with our allies, with Europeans, their view on trade and technology with China is very different than ours. And as we look at our own competitiveness and how we maintain innovation, we are going to have to be very careful of how we put limits on our own technology companies and their ability to commercialize in what is now the largest consumer market in the world, China. And this, I think, is going to play out very much so in the Middle East, because increasingly what China is exporting, or what China is investing in the Gulf countries, is technology. We see it through 5G with Huawei. We see it through artificial intelligence. We see a growth in the private sector companies from China that are establishing there. And while the Trump administration used 5G as a real red line with countries, we're going to see something we're concerned we're going to see, as what my boss Hank Paulson says, an economic iron curtain, where we start to say, if you are developed with your 5G system and the whole ecosystem around technology is a part of that, you will not be able to join with the United States, with our other allies in your systems. And that, I think, is a real potential. And for a country in like the UAE that prides itself and views its competitive advantage as staying ahead of all the technological developments, it's something that I think both US companies and Middle Eastern companies are going to have to navigate very carefully.
Sorry, I couldn't get the mute button. That's very apt, Deborah, because that's already happening in the UAE and has happened, especially with 5G. And both the Trump administration and I'd say the Biden administration have laid down some very, very clear red lines about 5G for the future. And what I hear from Emirati partners and leaders is, fine if you want to raise concerns with us about a particular technology, but then bring us an alternative. To your point, Deborah, the UAE does want to stay at the cutting edge and ahead of the Joneses in this regard. And when we don't have an alternative to bring to them, they're left very much wondering what to do and how to navigate this. So very, very apt.
Absolutely. We don't make 5G telecom equipment. So yes.
Afshin, let's hone in on business a little bit more. You've written widely and presciently about the UAE as a major global trading hub, buttressed by its strategic location, its world-class infrastructure. Unsurprisingly, this has made the UAE the perfect location for Chinese investment in infrastructure, both hard infrastructure, like at Khalifa Port, and digital infrastructure, as Deborah and I were just discussing. Chinese companies are also increasingly winning bids for major infrastructure projects, such as the railroads and iconic buildings. While these companies cannot compete with American companies on quality and cannot match American ingenuity, perhaps, as some would argue, they can undercut them on price for sure. What do these dynamics mean for US business in the UAE and the Gulf going forward? And then Michelle, I want to draw you into this discussion as well because of your expertise in this area. Go ahead, Afshin.
Thanks, Danny. You know, in many ways, when President Xi delivered those two famous speeches in 2013 in Kazakhstan and Indonesia, announcing the One Belt, One Road, which is what it was called at the time, initiative. You know, the UAE was almost purpose-built for the Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, after all, its infrastructure, its ports infrastructure, you know, Dubai International Airport surpassed London Heathrow in 2014 as the busiest international air hub in the world. The Jebel Ali port is one of the busiest container terminal ports in the world. Abu Dhabi entities have been investing in infrastructure around the world. So I mean, in so many ways, the UAE was doing Belt and Road before Belt and Road was a thing, so to speak. So it made sense for China to, that's why I described this relationship as an organic relationship in many ways. When China was looking around for Belt and Road projects, in some ways they were chasing what was already happening because they were noticing Chinese ships turning up in Jebel Ali port. They were noticing Chinese companies and Chinese businesses and Chinese traders, as Dr. Wang noted, turning up in Dubai in the mid 2000s. And so it was almost purpose built. Now, when it comes to competing with the US, I think this is an important point. You mentioned infrastructure, Danny. Yeah, I mean, this is the case around the developing world. It's very, very difficult to compete with China on infrastructure. But to Michelle's point, as Mark Twain once famously said when he saw his obituary in the newspaper, the news of my demise has been greatly exaggerated. I think the news of the US demise in the Gulf and the news of the US demise in the Middle East has been greatly exaggerated as well. Just look at the U.A.E, U.S. defense companies, many of your member companies, Danny, U.S. healthcare companies, education, technology. I mean, the U.S. is not a Johnny-come-lately to the U.A.E or to the Gulf Arab states as well. So we talked a lot about strategic diversification. There's certainly a commercial diversification going on as well, or an economic diversification going on as well. So yes, it's difficult to compete with China on infrastructure, but there's still plenty of things that the United States is doing in the U.A.E and across the Gulf that shows that the U.S. is still a strong presence across the region.
Thank you, Afshin. And Michelle, would you agree that the U.S. is leading in this regard still, and that we are, head and shoulders above the Chinese in this regard?
No. It's not about the U.A.E. I live in New York, and I remember when the Hudson Yards project was built, it was called the Dubaification of New York. And I thought that was a very interesting description, because I think the thing that China has that makes it very relevant to a lot of emerging market countries is that a lot of the stuff has been built recently. And so if you look at the fintech industry, right, like in the US, you have a lot of infrastructure with credit cards and payments. And the reason why, Alipay exists way before Apple Pay, because the Chinese went from cash directly to fintech. And so there isn't a lot of heritage with infrastructure. And so if you come to an American company and you explain the idea of Dubai or a project in Dubai called Dubai South, there are many, many cities like that in China that have been built from scratch over the last, 20, 30, 40 years. So I think there's a lot of alignment between a place that is not built like China versus a place that has a lot of infrastructure like the United States. And that applies to manufacturing, construction, financial services, a lot of industries like that. You look at the QR codes adoption in the US, and it's something that Chinese have adopted for a long time. It's the only place that, now that I work in technology now, it's the only region that American companies are continuously monitoring, which is what are Chinese consumer apps doing? What are Chinese trends? What are consumer approaches there? How do people trade, socialize, etc.? A lot of the stuff that is happening here has been happening there for a long time. So I think when you are a country like the U.A.E, this is really less about the U.A.E and more about China. You look at somebody who basically understands where you're coming from, that you're coming from very simple infrastructure. A lot of the time is greenfield stuff. And I think that's a competitive advantage to China when it's trying to do projects in a lot of these places. It's probably more challenging for China to do something in France or to do something in Spain or maybe Buenos Aires, which is super built and kind of overbuilt in that way. And the other quick thing I just want to mention is, I think at the same time, while I'm very, very I feel that China has a very strong advantage, I think it's important to right-size China's perspective of the Middle East. It's not a very sexy place compared to a lot of other places that China's excited about, like Africa, like Central and Eastern Europe, like Southeast Asia. And it's not a place of maximization of opportunity. It's really a place of risk minimization, and really thinking about it in a couple of ways. Number one is the Hu Jintao coined term, the Malaga dilemma, right? So there's that thinking. And then the other thing is the continuous preemption of the Uyghur sympathies and making sure that these countries are very, very diligent and clear on having very China-friendly views on that issue, and also making sure that their populaces are not supporting those people in the same way that perhaps some populaces in the Gulf were supporting jihadis in Syria. And so it's really not the place where China is going to make most of its money. It's not like a posting in the US where if you are posted as an ambassador to Riyadh, it's a great post to jump from that into a senior position. No Chinese bureaucrat is going to make their name in the Gulf. They make their names in a lot of other places, like Korea, like the US, like Europe. So I think it's important also for us to be honest about where we stand vis-a-vis China's worldview and the opportunities. This is not going to be one of the largest population places in the world. Africa is a lot more exciting. India is a lot more exciting. India is out for them. So I really think there's a lot of other places that Chinese are thinking about. So we're really not the center of the Chinese thoughts and ideas. And I think it's important to note that, while at the same time appreciating the first point I made about how genuinely attractive China's approach to technology and business, and having come from a place where Dubai comes from that. And Afshin, I'll do a shout out for your newsletter, Shanghai, Mumbai, Dubai. There's a reason why you sync those words together. It's not just because they rhyme, but also they've all been built very recently.
Thank you, Michelle. Well, the Biden administration is going to spend $2 or $3 trillion on infrastructure reinvestment in the U.S. here in the next few years, if they have their way. So maybe we'll start doing some more greenfield investment in the United States very, very, very soon. And
Inshallah.
Yeah, inshallah.
As Biden said.
Thank you. Deborah, we just hosted the Ministry of Energy yesterday, and we hosted a webinar on the Hydrogen Alliance in Abu Dhabi last week. We're talking a lot about renewables with climate change, the climate change summit that's coming up in Washington in another 10 days or so. Can you talk a little bit about China's role in the renewable space in the Middle East, in the U.A.E. in particular, and any thoughts you have on how this competition is impacting Gulf countries overall, and how it might impact the Biden administration's role there? Secretary Kerry had a very successful trip to the region over the weekend and met with 8 countries in a multilateral forum on climate change.
Great. Well, really excellent question, because clearly China is the dominant player when it comes to anything related to climate change. It really doesn't matter almost what any of the rest of us do if China doesn't start to reform. And it's very fortunate that China has got a very ambitious agenda. They have now created the largest green bond market. When they launch their national carbon exchange, it's going to be the largest in the world, even though it only covers one industry, and that's power. And it will account at that point for almost 50% of China's carbon emissions, but 14% of global emissions. And as part of what they're doing, they're looking to kind of export climate change and use that as a platform for building domestic relationships with other countries. They've been trying to do this with the Europeans, and we see them starting to do it with the Middle East. I know that they have been not only supplying a lot of the solar panels for some of the massive solar farms that are being built, but also doing a lot of the financing. And so the opportunity to work on these issues, I think, is immense. And for the United States, clearly it's in our interest to see that all countries are working together on climate change. And we're very hopeful that Secretary Kerry will continue to have good relations with his counterpart, Xie Jianhua, in China to work on these issues. But longer term, what is really core to the solution on climate change, just a quote from Bill Gates, is technology. And if technology is going to be the biggest challenge between the United States and China, we have the great potential to have a clash when it comes to clean tech. And we're starting to see the area where already the United States and China are competing. Look at new energy vehicles. China, and going to the point you were talking about leaping infrastructure, China knew that it could never be competitive when it came to traditional cars, but they could be competitive in developing green cars. And so now they dominate the world, and they're starting to export these. You're starting to see them across the Middle East. Same with lithium-ion batteries. And so while I think at a high level, there's a lot of potential for cooperation, I think when it comes down to the specific areas and specific technologies, we really are facing the potential of climate wars around technology.
Wow, that's a fascinating point. I have not heard it quite put that way before. I've heard of climate wars with regard to just facing what's going to come from Mother Nature, but I haven't heard it put that way before. Dr. Wang, I want to ask you to say a few words about what's going on the ground with regard to Chinese tourists, Chinese residents in the UAE today. And then Paul, I'd like to come back to you and to Afshin and Michal and maybe Brian to talk about the big gorilla in the room that I think I've only heard mentioned once in this whole discussion, which is Iran and China-Iran cooperation. But Dr. Wang, please, first over to you.
Okay, Danny, I think, we know that there's a very large number of Chinese living in the UAE. So that's the Chinese expat community. We know that in the year before the pandemic, we have 270,000 Chinese in Dubai alone. And that number has declined, but then these people actually are in Dubai to make money. But the Chinese tourists, and they are in Dubai to spend money. So they're actually very, very important. And they're in a much bigger number than those who live in Dubai as residents. And so we know that in 2019, there were 169.2 million outbound journeys made in China. And only 1/10 of Chinese actually had passports to travel. So this is a huge market. It's not important and just for the UAE. It's also important for many countries around the world. And the Chinese still primarily travel to Southeast Asia, to Europe, and to Australia. And now, but they're also increasingly coming to Africa, Middle East, and then Dubai is definitely becoming a very important hub for Chinese travelers. And now most Chinese travelers would come during these golden weeks, Chinese New Year, the National Day holidays. And then last year, the year before the pandemic, China was one of the top 6 tourist source markets of Dubai. So that's what's very, very important, has changed many dimensions, many aspects in Dubai, signages and then brochures, advertisement. And you see Chinese languages in the city. It's pretty obvious that Dubai is trying very hard to attract Chinese tourists, but then a lot of things have changed, especially during the pandemic. And we also know that China has unveiled this dual circulation strategy last year, and it's really looking inward now. So the internal circulation now is much, much more important for China. The Chinese tourists are not traveling anymore. They are inside China. And this is going to have a huge implication for not just the UAE, but almost every country in the world that used to see China as this huge source market. This is going to, of course, affect Dubai's strategy. But I think Dubai has not always been relying on China as the only source market. It has been actually looking at ways to attract Russians, Indians, and then Americans and British and so on and so forth. So Dubai will have to deal with the ramification of China's turn to internal circulation, and then in the years to come. But the Chinese are ready to travel. This is for sure. So and when the door opens again, they will be looking to travel, and so they will be going to places that are that can offer these accommodations and are friendly to them. So Dubai is definitely one of the countries, one of destinations, one of the cities on the list to travel.
And Abu Dhabi as well. I mean,
yes, definitely.
Abu Dhabi, there were a lot of Chinese tourists there as well. So let's talk we have 10 minutes left, and we've covered a lot of ground. But Paul, we haven't really talked about Iran. We haven't talked about China's role with Iran. And I'm fascinated by what the Chinese are doing at the moment with the Iranians with regard to investment, $400 billion new investment in return for steady oil supply. And I guess my core of my question, or the core of my interest is, how can Iran, given the givens in the Gulf's relationship with Iran, how can China cozy up to both at the same time? And I'd love to draw people's thoughts out on this. Maybe Paul, give you just a chance to say a few words from your conflict management point of view, and then open it up to Afshin and Brian and Michal and Dr. Wang and Deborah and others. Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, thanks, Danny. And I'm sure Afshin is tracking this closer than I am. But first of all, this is not new. It's not a new development. Even this deal in different forms has been announced and re-announced several times. And when you talk to Chinese officials, they emphasize that they're doing business and investment in economics and trade in one road, one belt. They don't want to get into the geopolitics or picking sides. They pride themselves on maintaining good relations with everybody on all sides of conflict, whether it's in the Middle East or somewhere else. For Iran, I think the most important, set of questions is, does the Chinese option, as it were, really represent a strategic option for them? I think economically, no doubt, it's a bit of a lifeline. But I think anybody who follows, the Iranian economy closely, you can say, yes, as the supreme leader says, we can be a resistance economy, we can hunker down for years and decades. But the relationship with China, at least not in the immediate future, that's not a replacement to normalization or opening up, lifting of sanctions, and all the other things they're seeking from the US. It can be an option while being a resistance economy. Secondly, as Deborah and others have mentioned, China is not offering any security or, that kind of umbrella. So for Iran's security concerns, which have just been heightened by the Abraham Accords and by the great advances in technology that US military, Israeli, and in relationships to the Gulf, the Iranians see that as existential threats. China has nothing to offer there. I'll end with, the question mark is about how this will affect negotiations with the US and the road forward. And I think, we'll have to see. On the one side, it gives Iran the ability to hunker down more, to be tougher, to, raise the ante as it approaches negotiations with the US. On the other hand, I think it's a positive thing that both China and I would say Russia have some influence with Tehran, that if things get going, these could be partners that could encourage Tehran and say, look, we're on, we understand you, we got your back partly, but it might be a good idea to move forward with the US and to normalize relations, not only with the US, but also with partners in the Middle East and the Gulf. As you say, China wants to maintain and build good relations, certainly with all the GCC states. It has energy interests in both. It doesn't want to pick and choose. So China potentially could be an encouragement if Iran and the US really begin serious talks. Thanks.
Thank you. Brian, why don't you give it to us from
Sure.
Well.
Yeah, great. And Danny, I want to thank you because this conversation is rare, especially here in Washington, because it's about the future and the future in the Middle East. What strikes me, I speak on panels in Washington, and so much of the discussion is either stuck in a moment we can't get out of, or litigating fights from 10 or 15 years ago. And you've really taken us to like 2023 and beyond. And it's the mix of excellent panelists too. I just appreciate it. That said, I want to go back to the past with a story to answer your question. In March of 2015, I was in Beijing with John Podesta, my colleague at the Center for American Progress. We were there to meet with Chinese think tank and officials. John had just left the White House, where he was a senior counselor to President Obama. And his main sort of role there was to execute a U.S. China climate agreement in advance of the Paris negotiations. We happened to be there at the time when the Yemen war broke out, when Saudi Arabia, U.A.E, and the coalition responded to these threats that they saw in Yemen and began the Yemen war. And at that moment, I was seated at a dinner next to a Chinese general. And I said, what are you going to do about this situation? And the general responded, we're going to get out. Any of our citizens that are there, just like we did in Libya, we don't see ourselves in playing a role of getting deeply enmeshed in these internal security dynamics. Sovereignty and not national sovereignty is an important role. And that's a role that America really has not played. I mean, we all know the story of the last 5 or 6 years and sort of the lack of a sense of strategic reliability when it comes to what is the US doing strategically in the Middle East on individual files. And I think that's still an open question. But China essentially said, we want to stay above the fray, was the answer at that time. Flash forward to the present day right now. And I do think the interesting question related to Iran, for me, is less related to the nuclear file, because I think there'll be dozens of working groups and things that, very important issues. But it's this question of national sovereignty and the stability of the region, and whether China actually raises its voice about the role that that Iran and other actors play in actually threatening strategic stability across the region. I doubt they will, but it's an interesting, given that their position, and understand my point, that they are strongly adherent to their own idea that nations should be sovereign and there shouldn't be internal interference. Well, as we've seen in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, across the region, including Lebanon, there's been a heck of a lot of interference that has undermined the economic and political models of those countries. I don't think for a moment that China is about to step out and lift its voice up. But if the US is serious about recasting its role in the region, it should actually have a discussion about sort of this broader regional stability when it relates to Iran.
So Michelle, Afshin, Dr. Wang, Deborah, one finger intervention on this last point. We have 4 minutes left. We'll just go down the horn. Go ahead, Michelle, first. You're on mute, Michelle.
I'm too polite. I just want to say on this large deal with Iran, I'm extremely skeptical. Just look at the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, talk to Andrew Small, and just see the progress. A lot of fanfare. It's been 6 years so far. It's first started off by Pakistanis getting pissed that Pakistani companies were not getting deals. Then different ethnicities within Pakistan were getting pissed. They're not getting deals. Then you have the terrorist attacks. And you can imagine all of that happening in Iran. And so I think we just all of these very large, things are very difficult. And just compare that, not to throw a tip from my country, but the Sinopharm deal is very specific, very tactical. It's not going to change the geostrategic balance of the region, but it's a real small thing. And I think we should just be skeptical of these large 20, 30 years. I think China had a deal like that with Russia and has a deal like that with a lot of places. So I'll just leave it there.
Thank you. Dr. Wang?
I would actually agree with Michelle. I think, there's a lot of discussions about how China-Iran agreement is going to change the perception of China in the region. And I think what's going to really shape the perception, especially public perception of China in the region, is what China is doing in the country, in the region, in the U.A.E. And so now we've seen that China has been using vaccine, for example, as a way to boost its soft power. It's actually worked to some extent. And then I've actually conducted a small research actually looking at the perceptions of China during the pandemic. And it's actually quite surprising that, there's a, greater positive actually, impression about China. And this is something that very specific and then just deals with one thing. And like Michelle said, and so I think that's probably going to be, what China is actually perceived. It's through these kind of very specific projects instead of this great grand, 20-year long agreements.
Thank you. Deborah, go ahead.
I would say that as the United States is looking to build its own set of allies in its approach towards China, China is looking to use its economic power and its vaccine diplomacy and other diplomacy to build or at least neutralize its own set of allies. And we see it whether it's through the increased number of trade agreements that they're negotiating, including wanting to do a free trade agreement with the GCC or the creation of RCEP or even the consideration of joining the TPP. But they really don't want to be left out and be isolated as the US tries to build its own set of allies to develop policies towards China.
Thanks. Afshin, over to you for the last word before Dr. Salem wraps it up for us.
Great. Thanks again, Danny. So on China, Iran, I share my friend Michelle's skepticism on this deal. And, I often say when it comes to China, Iran, follow the money, not the MOUs. We see lots of MOUs signed all the time. And as someone who's been following this for a long time, I've seen the pattern. An MOU is signed, it makes big headlines because it's a sexy story. It looks like there's a geopolitical realignment taking place. And then China actually drags their feet on these projects. If you want to talk to someone who's frustrated about China, talk to an official from the National Iranian Oil Company. And they will tell you that China was willing to sign everything, but then they never pursue the projects. And why do they never pursue the project? Again, this gets to back another point that Michelle made about right-sizing China's gaze in the region. Iran has a GDP roughly the size of the state of Ohio. China still sends $400 billion worth of goods to the United States. They do fear US sanctions, right? And so when they get sanctioned like this for deals that they do in Iran, they tend to drag their feet. CNPC has been booted out of 2 projects in Iran for dragging its feet. So I think follow the money, not the MOUs. And just lastly, I think just to point out that this China-UAE vaccine partnership, I think this is a real big deal. The most important issue facing our world today is global recovery. And we're not going to get to a global recovery without mass vaccination around the world. And if Pfizer and Moderna and AstraZeneca could do it, great, but they can't. So this vaccine partnership is going to be very important to getting vaccinations all across the developing world and the emerging markets.
Dr. Salem?
Yeah, I'd agree. First of all, I mean, with Afshin and Mishal, that, as I said, this agreement has been announced and re-announced a dozen times. It's probably a bit more important to the Iranians in signaling and, some of the opportunities than obviously it is to China, given China's varied interests. But in ending this really fascinating session, I'd want to pull back just for a moment and really look at the interconnection between global order and regional order. And at this point, the lack of global order and the lack of regional order. The Middle East has no regional order. There's no set of institution or relationships that tie together or manage the relations between the main countries of the region. If you take Israel, Saudi Arabia, U.A.E, Iran, Turkey, and Egypt, they're all parts of different axes. There are 3 ongoing hot axes in the Middle East. I worry that those axes will deepen and move towards more disorder. And the international order, which kind of began to break down under, after the attack on Libya or what happened in Libya under Obama, and then was completely thrown overboard by the Trump administration, and certainly being challenged by China and Russia. It's something that the US is trying to explore, rebuild, find a way for the great powers to reestablish some form of organized behavior, some rules of the road, despite the obvious and in many cases healthy competition. So what worries me to some degree is, in a region that has great disorder, at a time in the world when there is global disorder as well, which direction will these 2 dynamics go? Certainly there's a lot of opportunity in all of these relationships. Technology and trade and so on give the promise of a much healthier, safer, more prosperous future, but there's also the risk of locking into mercantile style trading systems, into axes that escalate conflicts in whether it's Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Bahrain at some point. So we are at a very interesting moment. I think this has been a very, very fascinating panel. Thanks, Danny, for the partnership and for putting this together. And thanks to all of these really brilliant panelists. I certainly learned a lot today.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day, a wonderful evening in the Middle East, a wonderful day in the US. We look forward to seeing you all again soon. My sincerest thanks to all of our excellent panelists. Take care and have a great day.
Thank you.